Hi guys, welcome to lecture 2 on differentiation. So in the previous lecture, we discussed briefly what differentiation is, what are the different ways of differentiation, and then we started discussing the criteria that you can use in class. And we went quickly over 3 types of criteria. And today we're going to go into it a bit more deeply with examples and a quick discussion of how you can use it in your class. So the first thing here is differentiating according to students' learning style. I think I've talked about this before in the previous lecture, where we said that each student learns in a different way. And accommodating your teaching style to fit that way makes it easier for them to understand your lesson and to stay on track. So the whole idea of different learning styles is that students learn in a variety of ways and that you can group people based on their learning style and how they learn. So for example, one of the learning styles is visual learning, which means from the name, you can tell using charts, visuals, presentations, videos, picture aids, colors, pointers, highlighters, and so on. A visual student would very much understand and grasp a lot of your lesson if you use those tools in your teaching style. However, an auditory student learns more by hearing. So when they read something out loud, when you have a discussion with them, when you give them clear verbal instructions, and so on, and you repeat to them, this is how they learn. A read-write student learns by reading and writing and taking notes. So whenever you see a student that does not or cannot understand except if they take a pen and paper and start writing down everything that you do or everything that you say, even if you tell them you don't need to take notes, that's a big mistake. Sometimes we tell students you don't need to take notes, but actually that student does not learn well except by taking notes. Now, a kinesthetic student is a student that learns by moving. So kinesthetic students cannot stay put for a long time. Usually ADHD students are kinesthetic students as well. So they learn more by gaming, maybe moving around, getting something off the wall, reading something off the chart, and so on. Role plays, activities, anything of that sort. Now, of course, this is really difficult to incorporate online, but a specific kind of kinesthetic learning is tactile learning, which means touching and feeling. So they don't have to move, they can just touch something. So maybe with a game online or something, they have to touch the screen or they have to match flashcards or something like that. That would appeal to them as well. So people are usually one of those 4 types. Okay, and sometimes you have a mixture of them, so you don't have to be just visual. You can be visual auditory or visual kinesthetic and so on. So it could be in percentages. So for example, I know that I am an auditory read-write student. This is how I learn. I have to listen to a teacher explain and give a lecture, and I have to take notes after them. So I have more than one way to learn. Maybe another student would learn more when they see you writing on the board, they see the words that you are saying, and so on. Now, what you can do here is, of course, you cannot divide students into groups and give them a task on that online. You could, it's one of your options to do in class, but it's the more challenging way. What I would recommend is just having a number of different activities in your lesson. So some of your activities would appeal to a visual learner and an auditory learner, something else would appeal to a note taker, and so on. So that's the first kind. Now, another recommendation I have is something that I did with my students last year, which is I gave them a survey at the beginning of the year to know their learning style. And then at the end, at the beginning of the very first week, when you set your rules, you get to know your students and so on, keep one day for the learning style survey. Give them a survey, talk to them first about what learning style is, give them the survey, and tell them you should be excited as well to know how you can learn best. And then when you collect the survey, you kind of get this percentage. So you know that, let's say, 90% of your students are visual, whereas 10% is auditory. So that means you need to focus on providing more visuals in class when you teach that class, and so on. Now, the second criteria that you can use when you're differentiating, in addition to the learning style, is the intelligence type. And this is basically a theory that states that everyone is smart in their own way. There's no such thing as a stupid person. Everyone is smart, but in a different way. And I usually like to talk about this with my students at the beginning of the year. So what I do is I give them like a session on, again, in the very beginning at the very first week of school. So one session could be our discussion days on multiple intelligence. And I ask them, I start with, so how many people here think they're smart? And then they start raising their hands. And then I tell them, if you did not raise your hand, that is the wrong answer because everyone should be raising their hand because we're all smart in different ways. And then I start talking to them about this theory. And this sorry, boosts their self-esteem a little bit and then tells them a little more about themselves and you get to know more about them. And then you start discussing with them the 8 types of intelligence. I think I said 7 in a previous video. I'm sorry, that was a mistake. There are 8 types of intelligence. And I'm going to briefly tell you what they are here. And then once you discuss with them the 8 types of intelligence, you can give them like a survey where they get to find out their intelligence type as well and then discuss it with them as a class, collect the surveys, and then create your own analysis. You get to know, again, the percentage of people who are, let's say, picture smart, people who are people smart. And we're going to talk about that in a bit. And then accordingly, put this in mind when you're planning for your classes. So let's say if you know that 90% of your students are people smart, then that means you're going to add a lot of group work to your classwork and so on. So if you look at the diagram on the left-hand side, it's a bit more detailed with examples and words, and the chart at the right-hand side is it's a bit simpler. They're basically the same thing. So someone who's kinesthetically smart or is body smart is basically your kinesthetic students or students who like to move around. So those are the kind of students who are athletic, who are fit, who like to use their body, who like to run, who like to move. They're students that score really high, usually in gym class or PE classes. That's the first kind. The second kind is interpersonal intelligence, which means people who are people smart, students who work well with others, students who work well in groups, students who are popular, who are good at socializing, at holding a discussion, at meeting new people. The third kind of intelligence is linguistic intelligence, and this basically means, for me, the students who score really high in writing and speaking in English. So any student who is good with words, they can express themselves well in speaking and writing. Those are students who are word smart. They know how to find the right words to express themselves. The next kind is mathematical intelligence or logical intelligence, and as the name states, students who are good with things like logic, math, numbers, analysis, and so on. And you're going to find that sometimes you have some students who are really, for example, good at English, but they're not good at math, like myself. For example, I'm really bad with numbers, but I'm an English teacher, so you can tell that I have linguistic intelligence, but I'm not intelligent when it comes to math at all. You're going to find the opposite as well in your classes. Students who are really smart when it comes to math, but they have difficulty expressing themselves using words. A naturalist or a student a student who has naturalistic intelligence is usually the students who score high on things like science, health, what else? Something that comes to, let's say, environmental studies, global warming, all those kinds of topics. Okay, so people who deal well and read a lot about nature, animals, plants, the environment, and so on, biology, chemistry. Okay, self-smart is the opposite of people smart. So someone who has intrapersonal intelligence, not intrapersonal. It means it's someone who is intelligent with himself, and I'll explain to you how. Someone who is good at planning, reflecting, who's very self-aware of their own strengths and weaknesses. They can work alone really well. They understand themselves really well. Now, a picture smart, as the name dictates, someone who's good with visuals, they can read charts and graphs really well, or they can create their own comics or their own sketches and so on. And a music smart person is someone who is good with music. Anyone, for example, of your students who's really good in music class. Any student who knows how to tell the difference between different sounds, different tones, different pitches. When you're teaching poetry, the person who can detect the rhythm, for example, or the beat of your poem, that's a musically smart student. A student who's good at composing maybe different tunes, writing different notes, that's again a student that has musical intelligence. Now, as I said earlier, once you start with this discussion with your students at the beginning of the year, you get to let them open up their minds to something else they didn't know about themselves, and you get to know them as well. So once you discuss it with them and then they get to know that they're good at this, they're good at that, they can actually start suggesting ways for you to cater to them. This is one thing. The other thing is that you can take this into account when you are planning your class. Now, I'm not saying group them and give them tasks. I'm just saying provide a variety of choices. You can, when you're planning, think of that and put it in your mind and start accordingly planning a number of things that would appeal to the, let's say, 3 or 4 intelligence types that you have in the class. Now, the third most common way that people use to differentiate is to differentiate according to students' achievement level. And that just means how highly they score in your subject. So the simplest way is low, middle, and high achievers. So you're never ever going to find a class that is all on grade level. You're going to always find most of the class on level, which is your middle achievers. And then some of them are really challenging and really scoring really high. Those are your high achievers. And then some low achievers who are struggling and need extra help from you. So the key here again is to know, and then accordingly, when you decide to differentiate today by achievement level, when you provide the task, you can provide more than one version of the task according to your students. So 3 basic steps, and most of them start at the beginning of the year, and then the rest happens. The first 2 happen at the beginning of the year, or at the beginning of every quarter, or something. And the third task is ongoing throughout your sessions. So the first task is to collect data. So start by checking your students' scores in previous tests. Maybe you could give them like a placement test at the beginning or any kind of test at the very beginning to see where they are and then use that. Or if they took IELTS or TOEFL scores, if they're in high school, if they're in middle school, you have MAP exams as well. Maybe the previous quarter exam or the previous quiz that they had. You just start collecting the scores and start listing the score of each student. Then according to the score, divide the class into 3 basic groups. And you can you can identify it yourself. So maybe 8 and above, 8, 9, let's say 8 plus out of 10 is your high achievers. Anyone who gets from 6 to 8 is maybe your middle achievers, and anyone less than 6 is your low achievers. For example, I'm just giving you an example. And then you can classify the class accordingly. This is if you want to group them homogeneously. And then what you can do is divide them into 3 big groups. So there's 1 low achievers, 1 on middle achievers, and 1 full of high achievers. However, never ever use that term with the students because it could be a cause for bullying and it could be a cause for them lowering their self-esteem. You just need to choose a way to name them. So maybe I like to call them red, blue, and yellow houses or yellow teams, and then they just know. And then I ask them, okay, so are you in the yellow house or the blue house? They could tell me their color, and then they take their task maybe accordingly. All right. You can use fruits. You can use names of superheroes, cartoons, movies, famous characters, whatever you want. Just choose a way to name them. And then you can tell them, for example, later on, all right, so I want this to be done in groups. So if I want you to find 2 people of the same house as you and work on it together. So let's say every 3 or 4 students has to be of the same color, they receive the same task and they start working on it. The third step is during, or let's say before every session. Every time you plan a session in the student task part that we talked about before, which is step 3 of your plan, once you set the warm up, the mini lesson, and when you come to the student task, create 3 tasks. One which is beginner level, one is intermediate, and one is high, or let's say advanced. And then you can assign them accordingly to your students. And that's it for today. So we talked about 3 different criteria that you can use to differentiate among your students. What are the 3 criteria? Please reflect for a minute As we said earlier, it depends on your intelligence type and your learning style. How would you like to reflect? So you can say it out loud, take notes, think of it mentally. What are the three criteria that you can use to differentiate? And then I want you to choose one of them to differentiate with next class. So maybe you choose next time to provide to learn more about learning styles and provide, let's say, 3 or 4 different tasks. Maybe you decide to make it by achievement level and then you make it low, middle, high. So just choose one that you will implement next time online and start planning how you can do that. Thank you so much for watching. See you next lecture.